When my grandfather passed away, I thought the hardest part of settling his affairs would be coming to terms with the emptiness he left behind. He was the kind of man whose presence lingered long after he left a room, and his stories, his laughter, and his stubborn way of holding on to old traditions had always been the glue of our family. I never imagined that his last gift to me, his 150-year-old ranch, would become the centerpiece of a battle I didn't see coming. The first time I drove down the gravel road that cut across the acres he left behind, I felt something stir inside me, a mix of pride and awe. The wooden gates, weathered yet strong, creaked open as if to welcome me home, and beyond them stretched pastures golden from the summer sun, framed by the sturdy silhouette of the barn he and my father had restored decades ago. This wasn't just a property, it was a living monument to generations of sweat, love, and sacrifice, and I could almost hear my grandfather's voice reminding me, as he so often did, that a man who tends to his land tends also to his soul. Stepping out of my truck, I let my boots sink into the dirt driveway, the smell of hay and warm earth filling my lungs. Memories came back to me in waves, being a boy chasing calves around the yard, falling asleep to the steady hum of crickets under a wide-open sky, listening to Grandpa whittle wood on the porch while telling me how our family had built this place with their bare hands when the land was still untamed. Now it was mine, all of it, and the weight of responsibility settled onto my shoulders like a mantle I hadn't expected but one I was proud to carry. I wandered through the farmhouse, its walls lined with family photographs and shelves of leather-bound journals. I could still see the indent of my grandfather's chair near the fireplace, the place where he had spent countless evenings sipping black coffee and watching the flames dance. Every corner whispered his name, and for the first time since his passing, I felt less like I'd lost him and more like I was stepping into his shoes. But as with any legacy worth keeping, there were shadows lurking at the edges of that piece. I didn't notice them immediately, not until the dust had barely settled on my new claim to the land. It started with a shiny SUV that pulled up to the ranch gates while I was unloading a few boxes from my truck. A woman in her late 50s stepped out, her heels clicking against the gravel in a way that made no sense for country soil. She was dressed sharply, every hair in place, her lips painted in a shade of red that seemed more like a warning sign than a fashion choice. She didn't introduce herself with warmth or sympathy, instead, she looked me up and down as if I were trespassing on my own property. Then came the words, clipped and sharp, "So, you must be the new owner." "I'm Karen, head of the Homeowners Association." The way she said it made it sound less like an introduction and more like a challenge. I blinked, caught off guard, and then politely explained that the ranch had been in my family for generations and that I had just inherited it. She gave me a smile that wasn't a smile at all, the kind of expression someone wears when they're already planning their next move. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with authority, "this ranch is technically part of our community now. There are standards to uphold, rules to follow, and I'll need to see about getting you the guidelines." Her words hit me like a splash of cold water. War rules, on my grandfather's ranch. I almost laughed at the absurdity, but the steel in her eyes told me she wasn't joking. I remembered Grandpa telling me once about city folk moving out here, about how they brought their committees and their bylaws, trying to tame land that had never belonged to them in spirit. He'd always resisted it, keeping the ranch just outside their reach, and I had assumed that was the end of it. But here she was, standing on my dirt driveway, acting as though she had a say in how I mended fences or painted barns. I tried to brush it off politely, thanking her for stopping by and assuring her that I'd keep the place as it had always been. But she pressed on, pointing out how unsightly the barn looked with its chipped red paint, how the cattle grazing near the fence line were a potential hazard to children in the neighborhood, and how the ranch's entrance needed to be beautified to match the aesthetics of the community. Her words grated against me, not just because of their arrogance, but because every so-called flaw she pointed out was part of the ranch's soul. The barn's paint had faded under decades of storms and sunlight, its boards holding the stories of my family's labor. The cattle were not a hazard, they were the heartbeat of this land. And the entrance, with its rugged wooden beams carved by my grandfather's own hands, was not just an entryway, it was a symbol of endurance. Standing there, listening to her rattle off demands, I felt the first spark of something I hadn't expected: defiance. This wasn't just about rules or appearances, it was about respect. My grandfather had fought too hard, loved too deeply, and held too fiercely to this land for me to let anyone, especially someone like Karen, try to dictate its future. Yet, even as my patience wore thin, I knew better than to show my full hand. I nodded, pretending to consider her words, but inside I was already resolved. This ranch would not be bent to the will of an HOA queen. Karen must have sensed my quiet resistance, because she leaned in just a little closer, her voice dropping into something sharper. "I'll be keeping an eye on things," she said, as though she were granting me a favor. Then she turned on her heel, her perfume lingering in the air as her SUV roared back down the road. I stood there, fists clenched at my sides, watching the dust trail disappear into the horizon. For the first time since arriving, the ranch no longer felt like a sanctuary untouched by the outside world. It felt like a battleground waiting to be claimed. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and violet, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, just like Grandpa used to. The land stretched wide and endless before me, and I thought about all the storms it had weathered, droughts, floods, the passing of generations. It had survived everything because the people who cared for it had refused to let go. Now it was my turn. Karen might have stormed in with her rules and her arrogance, but she didn't know whose land she was trying to tangle with. She didn't know who I was. And for now, I decided, it was best to let her keep thinking I was just another heir fumbling with a legacy too big to handle. The truth would come soon enough, and when it did, it would hit her harder than she ever imagined. The following week confirmed what I had suspected the moment Karen's SUV disappeared in a cloud of dust. This wasn't the last I would see of her. If anything, her first intrusion had been nothing more than a scouting mission, a way to take my measure, to see if I was pliable enough to fall in line. She must have decided I wasn't, because from that moment forward, her tactics escalated with a persistence that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so infuriating. The first shot she fired came in the form of a letter, slipped neatly into my mailbox. It was written on official-looking WA stationery, complete with a gold emblem that tried too hard to look like a government seal. The letter was a masterpiece of arrogance. I was informed that the barn was non-compliant with community standards, that my livestock posed a risk of contamination and nuisance, and that if I failed to repaint the barn, relocate the cattle, and restructure the perimeter fencing, within 30 days, I would face daily fines of $200. The letter ended with a smug line that read, "Failure to comply may result in legal action or property liens." I sat at my grandfather's old oak desk, the letter trembling slightly in my hand, not from fear but from sheer disbelief. This was my land that had been deeded to my family long before Karen's suburban neighborhood had even existed. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice growling in the back of my head, reminding me that the land answers only to the one who tends it. The idea that some committee of self-important busybodies thought they could find me into submission was laughable, but the laughter caught in my throat when I realized how far Karen was willing to push. These people had money, lawyers, and a hunger for control. They thrived on intimidation, and they were betting that I would fold under the pressure like so many others before me. 2 days later, she came back in person. This time she didn't bother with fake pleasantries. She stormed up the driveway as though she owned it, clipboard in hand, barking orders at a couple of men in polos who trailed behind her. They moved around the property snapping photos, measuring fence posts, and scribbling notes as though they were building a case for trial. "You've received the notice, I trust," she said, not even waiting for me to answer before rattling off a list of so-called infractions. "This barn must be brought up to code. The fencing is unacceptable. Those cattle need to be relocated. And frankly, that farmhouse could use new siding to match the neighborhood aesthetic. We run a tight ship here, and your noncompliance will not be tolerated." Her words dripped with entitlement, but what struck me most was the way she carried herself, chin lifted, eyes narrowed, arms folded across her chest like a judge delivering a sentence. She wasn't just trying to enforce rules, she was trying to dominate me, to bulldoze my will until I surrendered. I stood there, arms crossed, letting her rattle on while the men circled the property like vultures. Finally, I asked, calm but firm, "Tell me something, Karen. Do you really think this ranch falls under your law?" She smirked, as if I had asked the most naive question in the world. "All properties within a 1-mile radius of the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision are subject to the association's oversight," she declared, tapping her clipboard as though it were a gavel. "Your ranch is no exception. The community has standards, and everyone must abide by them." That was when the spark inside me flared into fire. I knew she was bluffing, knew she was twisting vague language into a weapon to expand her little empire of control. My grandfather had fought this exact encroachment years ago, ensuring through deeds and county records that the ranch remained independent. But Karen counted on intimidation, on people not knowing their rights. She expected me to back down, to negotiate, to compromise. What she didn't expect was my resolve. "This ranch," I said slowly, pointing to the land that stretched out behind me, "has been here for a century and a half. My grandfather built it, my father worked it, and now it's mine. Your neighborhood sprouted up on the edges like weeds, but don't you dare think you have the right to dictate how this land is kept. Your rules stop at that fence line." For a moment, her composure cracked. Her lips tightened, her eyes narrowed even further, and I could see the fury simmering just beneath the surface. But instead of retreating, she doubled down. Defiance will only make this harder for you, she hissed. We've handled men like you before. Stubborn, backwards, clinging to the past. You'll either conform or you'll drown in fines and legal battles until you have no choice but to sell. And when that day comes, we'll finally bring this land up to standard. Her words were meant to scare me, but all they did was strengthen my resolve. I thought of my grandfather sitting on this very porch, watching the sun dip low over the fields, refusing to let anyone tell him how to live. I thought of the generations before him, who had weathered droughts, storms, and hard times to keep this ranch alive. Compared to those battles, Karen's Wa crusade was nothing more than a mosquito bite, annoying, persistent, but ultimately powerless against true grit. I leaned in just enough for her to see the steel in my eyes and said, "You have no idea who you're dealing with. This ranch doesn't answer to you, and neither do I." Her cheeks flushed red, her carefully composed facade crumbling under the weight of my defiance. She snapped something to the men behind her, who quickly tucked their clipboards away and retreated toward the SUV. Karen lingered for a moment longer, glaring at me as if she could burn holes through my skin. Then she spat out one last threat, "You'll regret this." With that, she spun on her heel and stormed back to her vehicle, slamming the door so hard the echo carried across the fields. I stood there in the quiet that followed, the air heavy with the smell of dust and tension. For the first time since inheriting the ranch, I realized that this fight wasn't going to be simple. Karen wasn't just a nuisance, she was a storm brewing on the horizon, a force determined to bend everything in her path to her will. But storms, no matter how fierce, always pass. And I knew, deep down, that this land and I were built to withstand far worse. If Karen wanted a war, she had just declared it, and I was more than ready to fight. That night, as the crickets sang and the stars glittered above the old ranch house, I sat at the kitchen table, Karen's letter spread out before me. I smoothed the paper with my hand and smiled, not with humor but with determination. She thought she had power. She thought her Wa was an unstoppable machine. But she didn't know the truth, not yet. She didn't know that the man she was trying to intimidate was not just another landowner clinging to the past, he was her governor, the very authority she claimed to represent. And when the time was right, I would show her just how small her power really was. Karen's threats didn't stop after that confrontation. If anything, they multiplied, each more desperate than the last. Letters arrived almost daily, each one more aggressive than the previous, citing new violations, threatening steeper fines, and warning of impending lawsuits. Flyers were tucked under my windshield wipers when I parked in town. Anonymous complaints were filed to county offices about unsafe agricultural practices and excessive noise from livestock. Every move she made was calculated to grind me down, to bury me beneath so much paperwork, fear, and hassle that I'd give up and walk away. But instead of breaking me, each letter, each thinly veiled threat, only fueled the fire inside. I knew her kind, people who thrived on intimidation, people who mistook arrogance for authority. What she didn't know was that her reach, powerful as it seemed to her, was laughably small compared to mine. The breaking point came on a late summer afternoon. The sun burned hot over the fields, the cicadas screamed from the tree line, and I was fixing a gate that one of the younger calves had nudged off its hinge when I heard the roar of engines approaching. 3 SUVs came barreling down the drive, tires crunching the gravel with deliberate force. Out stepped Karen, flanked by a small entourage of board members in pastel shirts and self-importance painted across their faces. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "This is your final notice," she declared, waving a thick packet of documents at me like it was a weapon. "The Wa board has unanimously voted to escalate legal action against you. If you do not comply immediately, liens will be filed, and we will seize this property." Her words were met with murmurs of approval from the people standing behind her, as if they were her jury and she was delivering a verdict. She must have thought this was her moment of triumph, the scene where the stubborn rancher finally realizes he's beaten. I wiped the sweat from my brow, set down my hammer, and stood tall. For weeks I had let her rant, let her bluster, let her build this illusion of power. But illusions don't last forever. It was time to shatter hers. "Karen," I said, my voice steady and calm, "do you know who I am?" She laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "You're a man who inherited a ranch you can't maintain. You're a relic clinging to the past. And soon enough, you'll be a former landowner when the Wa takes what you refuse to fix." Her board members chuckled nervously, emboldened by her confidence. I took a step closer, my eyes locking with hers. "No, I am your governor." The words hit her like a thunderclap. The smirk vanished from her face, replaced by disbelief, then dawning horror. The board members froze, their laughter cut short, their gazes darting between us as if trying to make sense of what they had just heard. I reached into my truck and pulled out the leather-bound folder I had kept tucked away, a folder containing not Wa letters but official state documents, signed and sealed, proving exactly who I was. I laid them out on the hood of her SUV, each page a reminder that my authority didn't come from some neighborhood committee but from the very government she lived under. Karen's hands trembled as she leaned forward to glance at the documents. Her face drained of color as the realization sank in. She hadn't been sparring with just another property owner, she had been waging war against her own governor. And now every threat, every letter, every attempt at intimidation was nothing more than a testament to her arrogance. She stumbled back, her voice breaking as she tried to recover. This doesn't change the rules. Everyone has to follow the rules. I straightened, letting the weight of the moment settle. Karen, you don't even know the rules. You've been playing queen of a kingdom that doesn't exist, bullying good people into submission, all because you thought no one would stand up to you. Well, I'm standing up. This ranch is not under your jurisdiction, it never has been, and it never will be. And if you or your board try to harass me, or anyone else in this community, again, you won't be facing fines or liens. You'll be facing me, in a courtroom, with the full weight of the state behind me. Silence fell over the driveway, broken only by the buzzing of cicadas and the distant lowing of cattle. Karen's entourage shifted uneasily, suddenly very aware of how small their power was compared to the man they had been mocking moments before. One of them muttered something about leaving, and another coughed nervously, already retreating toward the SUV. Karen stood frozen, her clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that only comes when a person realizes they've been exposed. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. This land was my grandfather's pride, his legacy, and now it's mine. He taught me that you never bow to bullies, no matter how loud they shout. You wanted to strip this place of its soul, to paint it over and tame it into something it was never meant to be. But you forgot one thing, Karen, this ranch isn't just land. It's history, it's family, and it's stronger than you will ever be. Her lips quivered as though she wanted to fire back one more retort, but nothing came. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, silencing the endless stream of arrogance she had lived on for years. Finally, without another word, she spun around, barked at her board members to get in the cars, and climbed into her SUV. The engine started, gravel sprayed, and within moments they were gone, leaving only a trail of dust and the faint echo of their retreat. I stood there for a long time, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the fields. A breeze rustled through the tall grass, carrying with it the scent of earth and hay, and I felt something settle in my chest, a deep, unshakable peace. The ranch was safe, the legacy was preserved, and Karen, for all her bluster, had been put in her place not with fists or fury but with truth. That evening, I sat on the porch, coffee steaming in my hand, and watched the horizon blaze with the colors of sunset. I thought of my grandfather, of the battles he had fought to keep this land free, and I smiled knowing I had carried on his fight in my own way. Karen had learned the hard way that power isn't about titles or threats, it's about integrity, about standing firm when others try to push you down. And as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, I whispered a quiet promise to the man who had built this place from nothing, the ranch is safe, Grandpa. They'll never take it, not while I'm here.